We'll make a start. So thank you all, as I say, once again for coming to session, well, 2 or 3, depending on how many you've done of these things, on day 3 of Triathlon England's big Reboot 2021 conference week. This session is all about being COVID secure. But before I kick off, I'll introduce myself. My name is Gareth Barker. I'm the Technical Manager at British Triathlon. Now, over the past year or so, and working with my colleagues in the events team, we've developed the COVID-19 guidance for event organisers in order to deliver COVID secure events. And a lot of that translates into some of the principles of COVID secure activity for clubs and coaches that we're going to look through today. I've also got my colleagues Ellie and Will supporting this session. They'll manage the chat box, which I'll come on to in a sec. And we're all here to support a positive learning environment. So before we get stuck into the session proper, I'll just quickly run through the house rules, and apologies if you've been on sessions already this week and have seen these, but they should all be fairly common by now. So yeah, just keep your microphones on mute so that we can all hear the speakers, and we've got some video clips in this session as well. As I said, please use the chat box function to ask any questions that you might have. I'll sort of indicate where we'll answer some of those questions as well as we go throughout the session. If you've not done so already, create your own learning environment. So find yourself a suitable place that you can engage and enjoy the session. We are recording this session, so please turn off your camera if you're uncomfortable with this, and also if you have low bandwidth, turning off your webcam can often help in these things. Goes without saying, for health and safety, that's one of my favourite hats to wear. Please don't walk, drive, swim, bike, run when on this session. Please mind your language, and we won't tolerate any swearing or offensive language either directed at any of the presenters or anybody else on the session. And we'd also like you to interact on social media where you can. So please use the hashtag #TheBigReboot to share your experiences and learning. Right, ground rules done. So as I say, welcome to this session. It's all about being COVID secure. Now, I'm fully aware, and I think it's something that we've all lived through, that many clubs and coaches have done some activity over the past year or so, but there may also be some that haven't or are new into a role or a committee position. So what this session will cover is the requirements around planning and delivering COVID secure activity. And as a result, the intention is that you'll go away with understanding those key principles of safe delivery, the personal and individual responsibility that everybody has when it comes to activity of a range of different types. And hopefully you'll go away with the confidence to safely stage activity by learning from others who are going to share their experiences in this session today. Now, given that we've only got a relatively short period of time today, I think we've got 40 minutes left already, what we won't be able to cover is the specific scenarios around group sizes, coaching ratios, who can lead what session under the current restrictions. As I'm sure you appreciate, that's quite an ever-changing picture. So what I'll do at the first point here is just make sure that you're all aware that is detailed in the clubs and coaches guidance, which is available on the British Triathlon website. I'll signpost you guys to that information towards the end of the session. However, please be assured that everything that we discuss in this session today will underpin the safe delivery of those activities. So that's where we're going to hopefully come out of at the end of today's session. So before we launch into the session proper, I'd like to get a feel as to where you are at when thinking about planning and delivering COVID secure activity. Therefore, using the annotate function, which if you're familiar with Zoom, you'll no doubt know where it is already, but if you're not, you'll see at the top of your screen a little view options menu, and then in the annotate, it's indicated by a little pencil symbol. Just select yourself a little stamp and indicate on this scale how confident you are when you're thinking about planning and delivering COVID secure activity. So I'll give you 30 seconds, a minute, something like that, just to get an indication, because that'll hopefully help guide us through this session this evening. So I can see plenty of people are stamping away, which is lovely to see. We've got a nice little range actually from what we've got so far. We've got some In the middle, sort of 5s and 6s, we've got some 9s and 10s as well, which is really good. So that's really good to see that we've got a breadth of sort of thoughts around this at the moment. Now, what we'll do is we will have opportunities for questions as we go throughout this session. And as I've mentioned, we do have some video clips, but what would be really good is where there are questions asked by people in the room, if you have personal experience of resolving that question, or you've gone through a process yourself which the question is being asked about, then please jump in. Don't wait for myself or Will or Ellie to jump in. You guys are living it on the ground. Therefore, your experience is entirely as valuable as anybody else's. So please contribute as much as you are willing to and as you are comfortable with. We really want to get that shared learning experience running throughout this session. Brilliant. Thank you all very much indeed for that. I'll just clear all of the stamps now. So we'll move on. Okay. It's probably worth just touching on this before we go any further. I'm sure it'll be very familiar to many, if not all of you by now, but it is just worth recapping where we've been and where we currently are. So this is British Triathlons and Triathlon England specifically. This is our outline of the government's roadmap that was published in back end of February this year. As you can see, steps 1 on the 8th of March and the 29th of March, we've been and gone, and we have now moved into, as of Monday, step 3. So I am sure many of you will have already hit the leisure centres, hit the pools, and taken your first indoor pool swim for quite some time. As the screen says there's much more that can happen now than where we've been up to this point in time. We've still got step 3 to come, so at the earliest that would be the 17th of May, and then I'm not going to be tempted into getting the crystal ball out and trying to predict what's going to happen from the 21st of June. We certainly hope there'll be some changes that we can make, but I will absolutely not be drawn into what those changes could look like, so you can hold it all against me at a later date. But hopefully that just shows you where we've come. And yeah, this is the clubs and coaches version. I do have an events one actually that I'll show you towards the end of the session as well. So that's where we are up to. So what does that look like in real terms? For those of you who have followed the path of our guidance throughout the last many months now, 9 months at least, these should be familiar to you. If they're not familiar, then it's absolutely worth us spending some time, and we'll go through them, and some of them will go into more detail in the following sections. So it's worth just running through these 6 key requirements. First of all clubs must appoint a named COVID-19 officer. All community clubs then must develop a COVID-19 action plan and risk assessment. All clubs and coaches must continue to comply with the government guidance around social distancing, that's before, during and after activity. All clubs and coaches must capture pre-activity health questionnaires, and that's to, again, comply with government test and trace initiatives across all forms of delivery. Clubs and coaches must ensure that everyone at the session maintains good hygiene and that provisions are in place to allow for this. And finally, all clubs and coaches must ensure that additional measures and considerations are in place for sessions with children and young people under the age of 18. Now, that long list of requirements may seem daunting, particularly having relatively recently come out of lockdown again, and particularly if you're restarting activity. So what I want to do before we kick off into the detail proper is just share with you a clip from Gordon Stutchbury of Sun City Triathlon Club, just outlining their approach in returning to play.
I'm Gordon Stutchbury from Sun City Triathlon. We've been working with the regulations provided by pools and British Triathlon to provide a safe environment for our members over the past year when we've been able to train. We've also been providing Zoom sessions, turbo sessions for people, which has been a great opportunity for coaches because working in a controlled environment, we've been able to monitor people's performance more accurately, and we can see the benefits that some of these sessions bring. We're getting ready to provide full coaching sessions again, full set of coaching sessions from the swim, bike, run perspective. We're working with the local pools, we're waiting for them to open, and we're looking at the current regulations to make sure that we provide the team and the members a safe environment in which to train. So things are looking pretty good for us this year, and we're looking forward to getting back into the swing of training and racing.
So I'm hoping at least that that's a familiar story for many of you, and you're all equally looking forward to getting back to doing proper swim, bike, run training as we go through the next few months. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to break down all of the key things into 3 sections. We're going to do preparing for activity, individual personal responsibility, and then session delivery, activity delivery. We'll take a pause at the end of each of these sections, and we'll take any relevant questions at that point. If your question relates to something that we're going to come on to, then I'll hold it over until the relevant section. So we're going to talk about these 4 things in terms of your preparations for returning to beginning activity again. So the COVID-19 officer, this is something that many of you will be familiar with, and we'll hear from a couple more COVID-19 officers as we go through the session. But it's worth reiterating that all community clubs must have that named COVID-19 officer for the club. This person can be part of the club committee. It could be the coach, someone from a coaching team, or just a member of the club. But what's important is that they have both the sort of knowledge and also the comfort in understanding the guidelines, the regulations. That's both British Triathlon guidance, but also the wider government regulations as well, because this person has the overall responsibility for the delivery of the club's COVID-19 action plan and risk assessment. So that's both the risk and mitigation planning, but also communicating that information to all parties to ensure that the necessary standards are met. Now, this individual doesn't have to be medically trained. And for those of you that have put on events, so from sort of end of July last year to the end of the year, it is a very similar role. So to that end, I'm going to now share with you a little clip from Helen Lawrence, who is the Sport Operations Coordinator at British Triathlon. And she's going to describe what was put in place for last year's Intelligent Training Days at Mallory Park, which were put on for elite and performance pathway athletes. So we'll hear from Helen now.
Hi, my name's Helen. I work on the major events team at British Triathlon, and I was involved in the planning of some COVID-safe events at the end of the summer last year for our performance athletes. Today I'm speaking about the COVID officer role. So it was someone who we had on the team who wasn't qualified specifically for that, but was involved in the planning from a COVID side, just to make sure everything that we were putting in the risk assessment was we were able to do, and on the day making sure it was done. So they also attended the event and checked in with stakeholders, participants, staff, to make sure those COVID guidelines were being met and that everything we'd put into place for COVID was being done correctly. As I say, it didn't need to be someone who was qualified, it was just someone who was aware of what they needed to do in relation to COVID and had been involved in the planning, so they could implement what was being set out.
Now, as we've said already, that person doesn't need to be medically trained. I was actually the COVID officer for at least 2 of those events, and I'm probably the last person that you would want being that first person on scene in a medical emergency. So, as I say, it doesn't need to be somebody who has that medical qualification. It is about the understanding of the guidance and being able to then relay that in a manner to everybody who's taking part in the activity. Final point on COVID officer, if you've not come across it already, we do actually have a role description, and that's available through the Triathlon England Club resources for COVID-19 on the website. That leads us very nicely into the COVID-19 action plan and risk assessment. Now, as we've said, all community clubs must develop that written COVID-19 action plan and risk assessment before starting activity. And it's also worth, at this point in particular, given that we're allowed to now think about doing more stuff, to maintain it through the operation. So it might be something that you need to revisit. from its maybe first iteration, subject to the changes that have come in over the last week or so. As we've touched on already, ownership of this plan and its delivering and implementing it sits with the COVID-19 officer. For coaches who operate outside of club settings, you should also be developing that written COVID-19 action plan and risk assessment. So the same message about looking at what's changed over the last months and weeks, updating it accordingly. And again, we do have templates for both clubs and for coaches for the COVID-19 action plan and risk assessment available on the Triathlon England website. So I've got another clip for you. This is Pete Dean from Trianglia Triathlon Club, who's going to share with you the process that they went through ahead of restarting their club activity, touching on some of these points.
Hi, my name is Pete Dean and I'm the COVID officer for Trianglia Triathlon Club based in Norwich, Norfolk. Our COVID plans have been quite straightforward. We followed the British Triathlon guidelines. We start off with a risk assessment for our individual venues, and we utilise Teams meetings to actually make sure that all of our coaches are fully briefed. All of our coaches for each sessions have access to PPE, and they start each session by reminding people with regards to the standard legislation and guidelines with regards to social distancing and not sharing things like training aids, etc. All of our attendees also have to complete a return to practice form, which is approved by myself, and a central record is kept. At the end of each session, we upload to a communal space following GDPR guidelines a list of who's attended and in what guise so that we can follow track and trace guidance for the future. After 21 days, obviously, such records are then removed and destroyed. Hope that makes sense. Thank you.
So that hopefully just takes you through what they went through, and all of the things that Pete mentions in the actions that they've taken are all in that action plan and risk assessment. You're identifying the risk of what could happen if X, Y, and Z, putting in plans in place to mitigate against that. Pete mentioned it in that little section there around social distancing. So as part of that action plan and as part of those risk assessments, clubs need to plan how they'll put measures in place. So wherever absolutely possible, everyone maintains that distance of 2 meters from other participants and volunteers. However, where it's not possible, individuals should maintain a social distance of 1 meter away, plus then implement additional mitigation to reduce the risk of transmission. Face coverings being the absolutely obvious one, and certainly something we've all got used to a lot more over the last year or so. The expectation is that clubs and coaches implement that 2 meters social distancing across your sessions wherever possible, and only consider 1 meter plus mitigation where absolutely necessary, which brings us very nicely onto that fourth and final point there around the first aid provision. There may absolutely be occasions where, in order to provide first aid, you need to get to that 1 meter plus mitigation. So there's a couple of things to take away here. Ensure that access to first aid is maintained, but also any equipment is that you have as a club or a coach is also maintained. Make sure that your first aiders are familiar with the guidelines and they've undertaken any appropriate additional training that they might need. I know that a lot of the organisations, so St John Ambulance, offered sort of COVID top-up sort of sessions so that people could feel confident in being able to respond to a first aid incident, but also any first aid equipment has been updated appropriately. So whether that's face shields, gloves, that kind of thing. So just making sure that those first aid provisions are up to date and can therefore be used in response to that in that COVID-19 environment. So that's that first section about all the bits and pieces to go through as part of your preparations. I'll pause now. Ellie and or Will, have we got any questions in the chat box up to this point in time that we can try and work through?
There are none currently, Gareth, and there's an opportunity now if anybody wants to raise anything specifically to that. I have put in a link to the club support documents that Gareth was talking about there in the chat function, so you can go and find those, role descriptions, risk assessments, all those sorts of bits via our website. If anybody does want to raise a point or to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can put something in the chat. We'll give you another 10-15 seconds or so, then we'll move on. But if you do want to speak up, just unmute and ask away. There's one there just come in, Gareth. If any changes are made to the action plan template, will these be highlighted?
As in the template that we've got on the Triathlon England
yes,
website.
I think that's what Andrew's referring to there, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who have been on any of the event organiser workshops that we've done over the last few months or so, it's probably worth me just touching on a point that I always make there. Whenever a change gets announced by the government, some people are surprised to learn that we don't actually get any kind of advance notice of what that looks like or what that means for our sport. It's absolutely true to say that whenever you all find out, we're finding out exactly at the same time. So that's why you'll notice that when an announcement has been made about a change in legislation or a change in rules, we're always playing catch up, because what we have to do is we have to wait for that legislation to then be published, so we actually get the words from the government. Concurrent with that, we're working with our partners at Sport England. We're also speaking through them to the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. So we're trying to really understand what that means for all of our activity. Only once we're comfortable that we've got all the right information to give to you, that's the point at which we release a new version of the guidance or a new version of templates. So we fully appreciate it's really quite frustrating that an announcement is made and then we can't give you that update straight away. There's really very good reasons for that, because we'd absolutely want to give you the right information, having gone through all those checks, rather than just knee-jerk react and then potentially get it wrong to then have to correct it at a later date. So yeah, anytime any changes are made, we'll make sure all of those updates are available through the website.
Great. There's no further questions at the moment, Gareth. So I think, and Andrew says thank you. So I think we carry on. Clearly, if anybody does have more questions that occur to you to go through, use the chat function. When we get these pauses, either myself or Ellie will pick them up and put them to Gareth. So yeah, please use that. If there is something that occurs and we have this break, you can unmute, but as we go along, please just put it in the chat box.
Magic, thank you, Will. Okay, let's move on to the second section. But before we start that, I had a question for you. So in the chat box, can you please tell me who you believe the most important person that you'll look after on the day where you're delivering a session or delivering an activity? So in the chat box, tell me who you think the most important person that you look after on the day of your activity. We'll give it 30 seconds or so to pop your answers into the chat box now, please. Okay, we've got a few answers coming in already. Give it another 15 seconds or so.
Several who seem to think you're very important on that, Gareth.
Obviously, they're talking about me personally.
I think so.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have it any other way. Any other way. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Keep filtering those through. But yeah, no spoilers. It's not me personally, although I thank you all for your consideration. It is yourself as an individual. It's sometimes always just worth asking that question as a little aid memoir. If you don't look after yourself, then how can you effectively look after the people that you're taking for a coaching session, leading a club ride with, putting on events, being a technical official? It sometimes goes without saying, but it doesn't hurt with everything else that we have to think about, that you do look after yourself. If you're not looking after yourself, there's even a potential risk that could put you and others at harm. So always worth just flagging that up right at the beginning of this section. But what that does lead into, so yes, you are wanting to look after yourself. So what does that look like? Now, this section is, I've taken this out of the guidance and I've sort of made it its own little section, because it is a fairly chunky sort of section in itself, and it's quite a bit to go through. So it is just worth spending a little bit of time on. And we're going to go through these 4 points here. And again, this is something that's very consistent between sort of the club guidance, the coach guidance, the event organizer guidance, the technical official guidance. So it's a theme that runs right across our guidance documents across the whole of the organisation. So we'll start with that pre-attendance symptom check. From an event perspective, it's the pre-event health declaration, but the principles is exactly the same. So what that means is that all participants, and when we say participants, that's everybody that is connected to the activity, the session, the event, must undergo that self-assessment for any COVID-19 symptoms. This is absolutely the same as the government guidance that we've had for months and months and months now, but don't leave home to participate in any club or coached activity or event if you or somebody that you live with has any of the symptoms that we're all now familiar with. So high temperature, a new continuous cough, and a loss of or change in sense of smell and taste. That's within the NHS guidance did change at some point last year. It used to be 14 days. It's 10 days now, as we understand it. So yeah, any point within that time period that you've had any of those symptoms, you need to look after yourself, stay at home, but you also need to look after everybody else who's attending that session. And you can do that by staying home. If you have any symptoms, then follow the NHS and Public Health England guidance on self-isolation. It's sometimes obvious that all of these things still exist, and they don't change when you're in a triathlon activity environment. So it is always just worth just touching on that again. In addition to that, participants and those that are taking part in the activity should be absolutely reminded it's their responsibility to be sufficiently fit and healthy to take part in the swim, bike and run. Think about any pre-existing medical conditions they may have. Long COVID is something that has only recently started to be looked at in a sort of medical way. We honestly don't know what that's going to look like. Nobody really knows what that's going to look like over the next weeks, months, years. If you're in any doubt or if you have any questions on that, then we do have more information on the website. But the recommendation for you guys as clubs and coaches, if somebody comes to you saying, well, I might have had something, or I'm still feeling a bit fatigued, or whatever it might be, the recommendation is that they don't participate in that activity. They may wish to undergo some sort of health screening, which might give them a better educated understanding of their abilities. Now, due to lockdown, and similar to that point, and obviously just having recently come out of a lockdown, individuals' levels of fitness might have changed, particularly in terms of swimming. We're now able to access indoor public pools again, but that's particularly the element that people may not have been able to do, have done as much as they would have liked. So think about the perceived level of fitness compared with what their actual level of fitness. So yeah, coaches absolutely consider that as well, either in that club setting, but also in a coach setting outside of the club environment. Hygiene is something that we probably should have all been doing for a lot longer and started to think about all of this a lot more, but certainly over the last few months, it's become the big topic, and manufacturers of hand sanitizer products have done very well out of this. But it goes without saying, increased hygiene measures must be in place at all times, and clubs and coaches are encouraged to make those provisions available. It does, however, run both ways. So the individual needs to be thinking about looking after themselves as well. So whilst, yes, encourage that regular hand washing, make hand sanitizer available or wipes available, get your participants, your individuals to bring their own hand sanitizer as well. It doesn't hurt. And most people will be carrying a bottle in the car or in your pocket or in your bag most of the time anyway now. Those common touch point surfaces, so gates, door handles, handrails, understand what the cleaning of those looks like as well. Where possible, individuals should be using their own personal equipment and ensure it's wiped down before or after use. Now, where shared equipment is used, as a club, you need to make sure that there's appropriate hygiene measures put in place to ensure that equipment is thoroughly cleaned before, during and after use. Where possible, it sounds obvious, but ensure all equipment is checked prior to use to avoid participants having to adjust or touch it, to make sure it's all set up ready for them to go. But then make sure that after the session is ended, remove unnecessary equipment wherever possible, so there's no temptation just to lean on something when you're about to start the session. Moving to sort of the third point on there around equipment and clothing, yeah, make sure that people take away from the venue what they bring, but also that they've avoided sharing that throughout the sessions, particularly equipment used around the head and face, so helmets, swim hats, that kind of thing. Where it's unavoidable to share equipment, then similar to above, it must be cleaned before use before another person. Where you operate as a club or coach, you look to offer, say, a kit washing service, put that on pause for the time being, get individuals to wash their own kit to avoid one person having to take all of that on themselves. But again, where it's absolutely needed to be shared, then it must be washed and sanitised, both the individual item and also the person before and after use. It's fairly straightforward, and I'm not going to labour the point anymore, but that hygiene message is all part of that individual responsibility. You have a responsibility to look after the people in your care and to make sure that the environment is safe for them to take part in, but those individuals need to look after themselves as well. And it's that collaborative effort that is at play. And then the final point is around test and trace initiatives. So they're called 3 different things across all 3 home nations, which is helpful, but in England it's NHS test and trace. And the opening up of our sector and the economy more widely is supported by the test and trace initiatives. So we do recommend that all affiliated clubs support this as well by promoting the use of the NHS test and trace app. So for any form of delivery led by the club, you can, I believe, download your own QR code. If you're based out of a particular venue, I think you just type in your postcode and it gives you a QR code for you to use. That also extends to coaches and volunteers, both in club settings and outside of club settings. So I've got another little clip for you. This is Andrew Wild from Alnwick District Triathlon Club, who's going to share a couple of tips with you about some of the methods that they've used to record some of this information.
Hi there, my name is Andrew Wild. I'm the COVID officer for Alnwick District Triathlon Club up in the northeast of England. In terms of the COVID situation, I guess like all clubs, we've found it certainly to be a challenge. But the guidance from British Triathlon has been really good, and in particular we found the Coaches Corner group on Facebook to be a really handy resource. Initially, we certainly found the amount of work that we had to do quite daunting, and so we took the decision early on to form a working group with the idea of splitting up the work as best as possible and avoiding putting too much on one person, and that worked quite well. A couple of other things that we found really useful. We adopted the online system Club Spark last year, and that's been great for tracking session information, which is obviously one of the COVID requirements, and also for being a home for some of the documentation that we've updated, like policies, procedures, risk assessments, etc. We've also started recently to move a lot of our paper-based forms into an online version, and that's helped with secure storage, and also it stops us having to pass around hard copies of these forms as well. I think most importantly though, over the last 12 months, it's been great to see the club pull together. We've made the most of a challenging situation, and we've had Zoom training, we've had virtual events, and we've done some charity work as well. And so that's been really good to keep the club spirit alive.
So that was Andrew from Alnwick District. So hopefully that's all useful, and if you've not come across that before, then hopefully you'll be able to take away a couple of bits and pieces there. Again, that's we'll take a little pause at the end of this section for any questions that have come in. Will, Ellie, anything to flag up there, please?
Yeah, one note, I've just put the NHS Test and Trace QR code generation link into the chat. So if you've not got that for your club sessions, feel free to go and get it from there. We've got one question there. As an event organizer, do we need to keep records of everyone's pre-event or pre-training health checks, whether it be participants, competitors, spectators?
Sure. So yes, event organisers are required to go through the same process. It's a pre-event health declaration in the event organiser world. Again, there is templates available for that on the event organiser system, which I'll touch on in a bit later. And yes, the requirement is to hold all of that information for 21 days. So that is, if the NHS Test and Trace services need to contact you, then you've got all of that information to hand. As Andrew said there, using some sort of online collection method is certainly preferred from a GDPR and data storage perspective as well. But yes, everybody attending the event, so not just your competitors, but event team, volunteers, third-party service providers, so your water safety team, your first aid provider, all need to complete that pre-event health declaration, and you as an organiser would need to keep it on file for 21 days.
Great. And there's one from Rosa there. Does the COVID officer have to be at every session?
Not as far as I'm aware, no. It's making sure, however, that everybody attending that session has the understanding of what needs to be done, what needs to be followed, and that everybody has that understanding of it. It's no use having the best risk assessment and action plan in the world if that's not then communicated out to the people who it's actually going to affect, so the individual participants. So as a COVID officer, you need to be able to have all that plan, risk assessment done in place, but then it's your responsibility on behalf of the club to ensure that everybody knows that and that there's processes in place for people abiding by that standard as well.
I think in that sense, it's probably similar to a club welfare officer, where they wouldn't be expected to be at every single session in order for that to go ahead. But everybody in the club needs to know who that person is and to understand the information that's coming out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Will. Okie dokie. We will move on to our next section, which is actually on the day, the delivering of activity. We've touched on this first point already around an injury treatment and administering first aid, so I'm not going to rehash all of that, but certainly worth checking in with those first aid providers or people who provide first aid to your club and coach sessions around what the expectation is in responding to a first aid incident. First aiders should certainly be adhering to all of the principles that we've covered already, so cleaning hands thoroughly, wearing face coverings, perhaps face shields, gloves, even those sort of plastic aprons where necessary. Avoid as much close contact as you can. So if it's something that doesn't need you to get all close and personal, then do that. But certainly wherever you need to, then if you're responding to a first aid incident or an injury, then you'll absolutely need to get into it to be able to treat effectively. But again, look after yourself if you are that first aider. Similarly, physios or their equivalents keep a record of anybody who's come to you or come in contact with you. And again, for those test and trace purposes that we've just covered. Around the whole social distancing, as I say, it's something that we've all become quite familiar and varying levels of comfort with over the last few months. But it is really important just to reinforce that all participants need to maintain their social distancing, particularly during those breaks in activities. So as a club organiser, a club session leader, a coach, just consider how you can facilitate that, whether there's designated areas for equipment and refreshment storage, how to avoid having sort of pinch points in those breaks in activity, so you're not encouraging large crowds to gather in a particular area. It is always just worth mentioning, and we do this in the event stuff as well, water bottles absolutely under no circumstances should they be shared, and it's really worthwhile getting participants to bring in their own refreshments in a container that's got their names on. It is also just worth mentioning, actually, the guidance for events is that individual competitors bring as much as they think they will need for the duration of the whole race, whether it's swim, bike and or run. There may be less availability of aid stations, which is why we're sort of putting that guidance out there. So bring in potentially more than what you might need. You can always take it home with you if you don't use it. When it comes to arriving at a session and then leaving and thereafter, again, maintain that social distancing as mandated by the government, particularly when it comes to groups of 6 and family bubbles and the ever-changing guidance that we're all getting used to now. That also includes any changing rooms that are available or clubhouse facilities. It's worth mentioning there that you as session organisers and as coaches will interact with the venues, and we know that pools have opened, pools and leisure centres have opened from Monday. So if you've not run a session since they closed, check in with them to see what's changed, what additional or different provisions you need to consider ahead of delivering your first session in that venue, because it may have changed. So well worth keeping that really positive relationship with your venues. When it comes to travel, again, it's that guidance to follow the best practice for travel. So minimise use of public transport where possible, limit car sharing, again, all of the normal stuff that we've come to get used to now. Walking and cycling, absolutely encouraged. As a sport, we have been, compared to many other sports, so lucky in many respects that we've been able to continue to cycle and run throughout pretty much the entirety of the pandemic. So we are very much aware of that. And as I say, a lot of people have taken up much more sort of walking and cycling because that's what they've gotten used to. So hopefully that's going to inform some positive habits that clubs and coaches will be able to take advantage of. It's worth just mentioning that consider limiting the time that you are getting your people to attend a venue. So maybe put specific slots of when that activity begins and say, don't turn up more than 5 minutes beforehand. That can also include guiding your participants to arrive changed, ready to begin warm-ups where possible, so you're not having to spend time waiting for people in change rooms and potentially having a group of people stood around waiting longer than what they need to. And finally, spectating. Spectating is probably not the word I'm going to use right now. It's from an event setting, spectators are no longer allowed at any event for the next few weeks at least. That's the current guidance. However, there are 2 exceptions. It's that parents and guardians of children and young people aged under 18, and where that's needed from a duty of care and safeguarding and welfare perspective, just consider limiting it to 1 person per child or young person where possible. And the other exception is carers for disabled people. But in both of those cases, again, as a club and as a coach, you need to consider how you can facilitate those non-participating persons. Just consider what space you've got to enable and facilitate social distancing. Now, to bring all of those last few bits and pieces to life, I've got one final video clip, and I'm conscious of the time, and I think I'm already nearly over. This is Keith Charlton from Write and Try Club. So hopefully he's going to just bring everything together that we've looked at in this session.
Hi everyone, I'm Keith Charlton. I'm a level 2 coach and I'm COVID officer of Write and Try. Everyone was really desperate to get back to in-person training after lockdown, and as a coaching team we were desperate to put on sessions which were obviously COVID secure but fun, challenging and stimulating as well. We involved a few changes that we had to make, but in the end I think we got the right balance. We started out with the British Triathlon guidance, which in turn informed our risk assessment. That meant we had a plan. Putting this into practice meant that everybody needed to know what we were doing and why we were doing it. Communication on this was obviously going to be very key, and a vital tool that we used was to video the trial sessions that we did prior to the main sessions commencing. This video was sent to all of our participants, which meant that everybody knew what they would see when they would arrive and what was expected of them. Everything went really smoothly in the end. Here's the video. I hope you see how it helped us.
Why is Gareth frozen?
I think he may have done. Gareth, if you can hear us, I would. Gareth, if you can hear us,
abrupt end to the rather jazzy music at the end. Hopefully that sort of underpins everything that we've talked about in this session today. Before I touch on the events, I just want to pause again for if there's any questions on that final section around delivering activity, then I'm happy to take those now. Will, Ellie, anything in the chat box, please?
Nothing as yet. We did kind of lose you for the last couple of seconds there. So, but yeah, there's no comments in the chat as yet. Okay, lovely. Thanks, Ellie. And as I say, if there's anything else that comes up in the chat before now and the end of the session, then we'll obviously provide answers. I'll keep these next couple of bits and pieces quite brief. I'm aware that I'm over time. It's just worth focusing on the events key requirements. Some of those are very familiar because we've spent some time talking about them already today. The sort of two key things that are specific to the event setting is point 4 and point 6. The point of those individual groups of one is to allow people, or rather to force people, to be set off in a socially distanced manner to begin with the aim of that then carrying through each of the race segments. We are a very different sport to, say, a cycle race or a marathon, whereby we go to transition once or twice every event. Those events are often just a point to point, so people can continue to maintain space. From 4 weeks after the opening of public indoor swimming pools, so from the 12th of April all the way up to the 10th of May, all events with a swim segment must be for participation only and not competition. For duathlon events, as I've said already, we're lucky that we've been able to bike and run throughout the whole period. They can be competitive from this point onwards and from the 29th of March onwards. After that period of non-competition, we are asking event organisers to be cognizant of the potential lack of swim training that people have done and to consider offering alternatives or shortened swims, for example, just so that everybody who wants to take part feels that they're able to do so in a safe way. And similarly, you've seen the clubs and coaches one, the events roadmap is a very similar picture. We are again past steps 1, now in step 2, so that's public indoor swimming pools are open, and that means that events for under 18s can now take place in indoor pools. Going to have to wait a little bit longer for indoor pool events for adults, which will be again the 17th of May at the earliest. And no, I'm not going to get drawn onto what happens or what might happen after the 21st of June. Right. That's a whistle-stop tour through the guidance, and I'd just like to get a sense check, really. Having spent the last 40 odd minutes in this session and hearing everything that we've gone through, how confident do you feel now in being able to plan and deliver that COVID secure activity? So again, annotate function in the more options or view options section at the top of your screen. Just put a little stamp on the scale there for us to see where we are now, please. Give you sort of 30, 40 seconds or so for you to get your stampers out again.
I fear that Gareth's actually finally left us at that point. I think his Wi-Fi has been struggling slightly as we've gone through the last few minutes, but he appears, I think, to have dropped out. I know he's joined us back again with the name Anne Weinstock.
That's not my actual name. Apologies, everyone. I have no idea where I went. Let me just very quickly flash the screen back up again. I won't be a second. I'm going to stay as Anne Weinstock for the time being. We're nearly at the end. There we go. Okay, so hopefully, if you can now see the little screen again, if you do want to just pop a little annotated stamp in there now, then that'll be grand. Fantastic, thank you. That's brilliant, seeing some 8s, 9s all there, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for bearing the brief technical difficulties. It was inevitable, I guess, wasn't it? It's worth just popping up that we do have all of this as guidance and support documents available in a range of different guises and formats. So we've got return to play guidance for clubs and coaches and also for event participants. That's available on the British Triathlon and Triathlon England websites. We've also got guidance for event organisers. It's the permitted event requirements guidance documents. I think that's the version 7 now. So that's available through the event organiser systems for those that are organising events with us. As I said, we update that guidance as soon as we're able to, following an update in government policy. The guidance for event participants, that's actually really something that we are looking to get event organisers to promote out to participants in advance of events. Anything you guys as clubs, organisers, club session deliverers, coaches can do to understand what events look like, where people are training towards events, that will really help in their understanding as well. You can download it as a PDF and then share that out as well. Finally, we've got numerous points of contact. We've got clubs and coaching, both Ellie and Will are here. If for any event organisers with questions or technical officials with questions, you can contact us on events at. And we've also got the Coaches Corner Facebook group that Ellie, I think, put the link in the chat earlier. And we've also got an event organiser network for those event organisers as well. So all that's left for me to say is just thank you. Thank you for your time in giving up this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you found it useful and interesting, at least. Where you feel inclined to do so, please share any learnings on social media using the hashtag #BigReboot. We've got another day of sessions tomorrow. I'll be back with Mark Buckingham, last session of the week. So please join any of the sessions that we've got going on. Following the conference, we'll send out an email to get your feedback and find out what you thought of all the sessions. And at the same time, look out for that virtual goodie bag as well. And then, as I said already, if you've got any questions that we've not been able to answer today or you've not felt able to ask today, then get in touch with the team, coaching, clubs, or even events. And just a final thanks to our presenting partner, Yellow Jersey, who are providing the insurance for cycling, for supporting us this week. That's everything I've got for you. Thank you all very much indeed. Good to see you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you.